Welcome back to the Act Two podcast, a podcast for the real-life working screenwriter. I'm Tasha Hugh.
And I'm Josh Hallman.
And today we have a special guest, so we are going to just skip the intro and get into it because I always get too excited. Scott Glassgold, welcome.
Scott.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I don't know if Josh told you, we've actually talked about you on the podcast already.
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
We've already mentioned you because we kept hearing all of this news about writers who were getting their short stories picked up and sold at major studios. And we were just fascinated by this. And thank you for coming on to talk about this, because I know this is a really great avenue for writers.
It's great to be here, and it's a very exciting time, and happy to talk about it all.
Yeah, I was saying to both of you beforehand, and I've said this to Tasha, we've talked about this on the podcast, I've seen your name so many times, and it was like, who is this Scott Glassgold, and how is he doing this? And so I guess before we jump into everything, I want to maybe give a little intro of who you are. And like kind of, you are the founder of Ground Control, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Correct. Okay, you are a manager, a lit manager. You represent directors as well. I'm doing a horrible job of this. Could maybe a quick little rundown of
Sure. I mean, Ground Control is a management production company. We represent a handful of writers, directors, and as you pointed out, prose writers as well. And then on the production side, I produce pieces that are unique into themselves and or working with clients who have projects that it makes sense for me to produce on. It's always a case-by-case basis. I mean, that's the snapshot of who we are, yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, do you mind me asking where you're from and like how you got into the industry?
Sure. OG stories. Let's see. I started out on the East Coast. I worked for studios on the East Coast. There was a brief period of time in the aughts where studio production and studios were really sort of thriving in New York City. So my first job out of school was at Disney in marketing, and then I went from Disney to New Line Cinema.
Did you study film in school, Scott, or business or marketing or?
It's a good question. I didn't study film, although I had always been working in the business since high school. Like, whatever. I interned at the local television station, and in DC, where I went to school, the AFI was based. Mm-hmm. I was lucky enough to spend a few years at the AFI, and it really amounted to just watching a ton of movies, which was great. And they had this building, and the original AFI office was in the Watergate. And Charlton Heston was the president of like AFI in the 70s, and he designed the office, and it was, I guess you would call it like wall to ceiling carpet. So it was this green carpet that was even on the walls. It was like, I mean, it was amazing.
Incredible.
There's no way that still exists because it's so damn cool. I'm sure they ripped it up. So that was awesome. But then I came out of school, worked at studios, and loved it, enjoyed it. It was an invaluable experience, but also simultaneously became very clear to me that I wanted to be doing something for myself that was a bit more autonomous and not working for the system, maybe with the system as we do now on individual projects or otherwise. But it was clear to me that wasn't my fate. So I came out here and made a movie called Hurricane Season. That was the first thing I did on my own. I quit New Line, and I put together this movie with Forrest Whitaker and Taraji Henson, and we made it for what was the Weinstein Company. And that was my transition from studio life to indie life, and I haven't gone back.
Damn.
I feel like there's so many mini stories within that, by the way.
There's a lot of mini stories, and I'm happy to answer any of them. You feel free to ask.
I always find the stories of how people got into this industry very fascinating because everyone comes from a completely different angle. Like, I've never heard this story that you just, no one's come near describing your story. So it's definitely fascinating. Did you know you wanted to, I guess, produce and be on that side of things instantly? Because you clearly loved films growing up and you just watched a lot of content. Was there ever a moment where you're like, I want to be a writer or I want to be a director? Or was it always like, I knew I wanted to produce?
I mean, I think what it was always came down to I want to make cool shit, and in whatever
Josh
form
says that all the time.
Is
want
that
to make
true?
cool
it's
shit.
like it always sort of like what my role in making cool shit varies, and that's kind of fun too. Sometimes it will be a hands-on producer. Sometimes it will be helping a writer shape their piece. Sometimes I'll have original ideas and I'll figure out a way to grow them. I think that's really exciting about sort of even where the industry is right now, in the sense of that flexibility, if you will. I'm still warming up on my coffee, so forgive me, but I'll find my words. But I think it's a really exciting time, as we're finding, even with short stories or otherwise, that it really is a moment where, to me, the genesis is the cool thing. And then drilling down further on, like, okay, what medium is that? Or what is the stepping stone medium to get it to being a film or otherwise? And it just feels like, whether it's an openness in the industry, the availability of technology, whatever it is, it's that confluence that, to me, it just makes this a really exciting moment.
I feel like you're the type of person who's embracing AI, and you're like, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to take it over.
Look, I'm always interested in whenever there's new technology or new whatever. I think AI is a particularly sticky one, particularly on the creative side, on the writing side. So I think there's not an easy answer there. I certainly have an awareness to it, and I've messed around with it with art and things like that. It's something I want to, like all these things that come up, and particularly even when they're controversial, is just sort of getting my head around it and getting an understanding of how it works, and then figuring out what that means for it to be a tool in my work. So I would say still an exploration phase for that.
I think that's smart.
Yeah, me too. Okay.
Let's get into the meat.
Let's get into some meat. So you're obviously the master of like these short stories and we're going to get into that for a second, but you've produced like a ton of short films. I guess I just want to dive into that, because do you see short films as an avenue currently for writers, directors to kind of like kickstart their career? And like, what drew you to short films? What kind of made you go down that world?
Yeah, I mean, I love short films. I think it's inordinately empowering. Mm-hmm. And that to me is what's so exciting about it, in that nearly any filmmaker, it will be that one moment in time where you can incept a piece, go produce it, cut it, and release it without anybody's input, outside of the people that you choose to. You're not beholden to anybody, unless you've got a really opinionated uncle, but or whoever is underwriting your short. But outside of that, like, it's really pure. It really is extraordinary. So, and even filmmakers that then get to a high level and are making films for studios or others don't have that luxury. Of course, there's always going to be the exception, but all things considered. So that's really great, because it's a true, very clear expression that isn't necessarily trying to guess where the audience will be or appease box office. So that in and of itself is cool. But however, it's just very empowering. I always look at it sort of in two buckets when you're making a short film, or at least it's the litmus test that I use to get involved in a project. Whereas, of course, it should be a calling card. And you should, when you're making a short, you have to say to yourself, and by the way, when I work with directors, it's the exact same sort of motto that we embrace, is like, as you're about to take a gig or whatever, it's like, can you do your best work? Because inevitably, particularly when making a movie, like, it's at least a fucking year of your life, if not more. And as exciting it is to get a gig, if at the end of that journey you're like, there was no way I was ever going to do something that good, it's not worth it. Mm-hmm. I mean, don't get me wrong. I recognize financial pressure, so I don't want to diminish that. But outside of like, holy shit, I need to, put bread on the table, it really, really is important that you can do something that you feel like will either further your career or frankly you'll just be proud of, right? And far too often, emerging directors who maybe have a little heat or have the capability to get attention will take a gig, and they'll come out the other side with no moves, because it's sort of like the promise of an emerging director is even more exciting than a director that made an okay movie, because the director who hasn't directed yet is like, oh shit, well maybe they are PTA. But when the movie comes out and it doesn't work for most likely not their fault, right? Low budget, bad script, but 100 reasons, then there's sort of a mark against them. So I'll get back to the short film question, but it's back to short film. What's so great about it is that it's a calling card. But then simultaneously, I always think that it's very important that it should be transactional. meaning that you want that film to end, and whoever you're showing it to, primarily, whether it's a financier or buyer or otherwise, I think you want them to look at it and say, holy shit, let's make that into a feature.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize the short film. And there's beautiful short films that get nominated for the Academy Award every year that are standalone and are tell a lovely story. And there's, of course, room for that. I'm talking specifically to what I'm drawn to, sort of a microcosm of that same reason I just laid out there, and that, like, it takes a lot of time and probably a lot of your savings. So if you're doing both those things, I think there's an obligation to have some form of a business plan. And that business plan hopefully is, hey, look how good I am. But like the calling card of it, look how good I am. It ultimately just gets you into the ODA line, which is just, you're just moving lines. Whereas if you're creating a property that you control and can leverage into getting financing, well, then it's all worth it. Then you've really leveled up and taken your talent and taken your time, which is just as precious, and move the ball down the field. That's why I love the short film, because you can do that for all those reasons. So I'm very much a believer in a short, for sure.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's, as you're describing, a director's calling card versus a writer's. Like a writer, do you feel like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, do you feel like doing a short film as a writer specifically, you don't want to be a writer-director, you want to be a writer, makes sense? Or are there other avenues that are easier?
That's a great question. I think inevitably the sort of attention that a short film gets is weighted towards the director. It really is a director's piece. Now, don't get me wrong. There's if you have an idea and as a writer, as a director, you really believe in, let's say you don't want to direct at all, and conceptually it's strong. You just make sure you've wrapped your arms around it and planted the flag that it's yours, because all too often what will happen is, this is great, we love this short, we want to bring on X writer or Y writer, established writer, and there's just less ownership in a short film. And I don't mean that literally, because you can establish whatever ownership you have, but it's just someone will look at it and say, well, it's fine, it's a 5-page thing, but we'll bring in a writer, an established writer, to write the whole thing. So I think it's something to be aware of, and I think there's value in it, but I would certainly be conscientious of that, because it's look, at the same time, it's probably a lot less work for a writer as well. So like in terms of, if you're simply writing a short film, not to diminish the work, but once you have concept, it is a shorter script, whereas a director and producer, like it's a longer journey for them. So I guess I never really stopped to think about it, because often when I'm making shorts, it's with writer directors, right? So it's call it an odd or whatever you want, but like it's someone who wants to do everything. But simply as a writer, I think there's value in it. Particularly, look, if you wrote X short and it got turned into Y movie, that's fantastic. Or if it's a really, really strong concept, I think that's a great way to sort of demonstrate vision and ability to conceptualize. It just, at the end of the day, I don't think it guarantees you to get hired to write the film. Now, if you then did a great short and wrote it on spec or otherwise, or made a compelling case to do it, sure. But I would hedge my enthusiasm ever so with all that.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay, I just can't wait anymore. We got to dive into the short story stuff. So you find short stories. You're a master of this. And I don't know all the areas you find it, but my knowledge is you find short stories on Reddit. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, to a degree, that's correct. I have found a couple stories straight from Reddit. I would say more often than not, I find writers from Reddit, and then we work together to create pieces. Oh. It's very rare to find a piece that's sort of ready to go on Reddit. Ever so often, conceptually, there's a piece that I'll get really excited about, and I'll connect with the writer, and maybe we'll develop a little bit further. But I think what I would say about the Reddit, and specifically what we're talking about is No Sleep, is it's a great creative ecosystem. There's really, really talented writers in that space. So it's a great place to connect with writers. But it's happened a couple times where we found pieces that were sort of fully baked on Reddit. But it's a little bit of a hybrid.
And so the general idea is that someone posts their short story to the no sleep subreddit. It gets kind of voted up, or gets looked at a lot and it draws attention. And that's how, if you're posting a short story on Reddit, that's how you get like eyes on it, right? It's through people kind of upvoting their short story. I can't even believe I sound so old. Right now.
I mean that's what the upvote does. It'll raise the profile.
Gotcha. Okay.
Of the piece. If you get more upvotes, I don't know fully how all of their analytics work, but I do think the more upvotes you get, you're going to have more presence on their homepage. And it's a very nurturing community. In like, if you have ever spent time there and sort of like read the comments are never like, oh, that sucks or that's good. It's always in world, and it's always like warning the character or giving them advice, or even if someone's like onto the story, they'll say it again, sort of like as though they're a participant versus an awful commenter that basically exists on every other platform in the world. So it's really sort of special in that regard. So that community is very thoughtful, very, very supportive of others. I would say the greatest resource it's been for my work is, like I said, finding writers, meeting people with unique voices. And from there, we'll start a dialogue, and we'll start a journey of figuring out what they're working on, what would be a good fit for what we do. And it's about sort of developing that rapport where I would say I've had the most success and, shared success with these writers, in that the voice, once I've zeroed in on someone who clearly has the craft, some of what I do is that orientation to that very, very narrow bullseye that we have of selling things in terms of like concept, clean idea, maybe star vehicle, whatever it is, all those sort of things that we check off in our invisible checklist that doesn't really exist, but sort of it when you see it. And I'll do a lot of that work where I'll read a special piece, and for one reason or another, typically it doesn't work, but we'll get on the phone and it's like, hey, what are you working on? And they'll list off 5 things. Like, oh, that one sounds kind of cool. And then we kind of just sort of deep dive from there. That to me is where most of the success has occurred. And it's sort of, look, it's incredibly fun and it's incredibly gratifying because, again, these are writers who are trying to break out, trying to grow their craft, have a success. So to be able to help bridge that is super exciting.
Do you find that the writers you reach out to, and you sort of answered another question I had, which is, what do you look for in writers? So you're finding writers who clearly have a craft. They have ability to track characters and tell a really engaging story, probably have a really good concept in their short story. And when you reach out to them, do you find that they typically have 5 other things, or are they like shocked to have your call and are like, oh, well, I never thought about it, that I could have a career in this? I'll get into that.
9 times out of 10, it's like, oh, let me send you my Excel sheet of 100 ideas.
Yeah.
Usually that's what it is. Particularly on No Sleep, it's funny. I think it all just has to do with sort of your environment. What I mean by that is, like, No Sleep is entirely uninhibited. You can submit as much as you want. You can submit whenever you want. If something doesn't work, it doesn't keep, in terms of audience views or otherwise, it doesn't keep you from posting again. And I think it's like whatever, it's nature nurture, if you will. So if you were born into that environment that's really conducive to just generating, and if it doesn't work, who cares? Fucking turn the page. I think that's conditioning, versus, frankly, out here, like, it could beat you down, right? Like, you write a spec, takes a long time, maybe it doesn't get the reception you want, and you're like, oh, fuck, okay, I'll write another spec. And it's hard, don't get me wrong, I'm not, I'm acknowledging how hard it is. But at the same time, in terms of output, because of that's the tempo of this town, it may limit your output, because that's just sort of, you're only going to get so many scripts to send out in a year or otherwise. Whereas there's sort of no rules there, and there's no barriers, that I find people are more willing to throw things against the wall. Now, look, I'll qualify that. it connects to what I was just talking about in terms of like the idea being really dialed in, because I think, to any of your listeners on this podcast, if you're a screenwriter, I think you're meditating for quite a long time, or you should be, on your idea, on your concept, and making sure, or at least hoping that it's going to satisfy some sort of bullseye. Because what's different from a short story than a script is that a short story in of itself is a fulfilled medium. You can put it out and someone can enjoy it. Certainly someone can enjoy a screenplay, but that's not its intended purpose. Its intended purpose is ultimately to get adapted into a feature film. So I think probably this might be a 9 a.m. ramble, so forgive me.
No.
I'm just sort of thinking about it out loud. But with the short story, there's something very gratifying of starting and ending and putting it out there and people are reading it. So I think that's why people generate so much content online. Anyway, I've gone off the reservation.
Not at all.
Help me.
No, I'm glad when you wander. It's all helpful.
Do you remember the first short story that you found on Reddit, and then you realized that, or maybe not even on Reddit, but anywhere where you found the first short story, and you're like, "Holy shit! I think I could sell this idea." Like, and then realizing this could be a business.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's a funny one too. So I work with a very, very talented screenwriter by the name of Harrison Query. He's sold a ton of stuff at the highest level. Right now, he has a pitch that we sold that John Cena and Idris Elba, heads of state, are shooting right now in Europe. So he's really about to sort of have his next level moment. But he's amazing. And he called me and he's like, "My brother wrote a short story. It's awesome." I'm like, "Oh, fuck. I have to read somebody's brother's short story."
You already repped him at this point?
Harrison I repped, but
okay.
the brother was, a brother that lived not in LA. And, all those things were like, "Oh, great. I got to spend 2 hours," whatever. And I read it, and no pun intended, and it was on Reddit, and it was amazing. It was just fantastic. And that was ultimately my wife and I bought a ranch, which we sold with James Wan to Netflix in a very, very exciting bidding war. And that was the first short story that I sold. So I really sort of hat tip to Harrison and his brother Matt, who is very, very talented. And since then, in addition to Ranch, which is actively in development in a very exciting way, they also did a piece called Wilderness Reform that's at Paramount right now. So we did that once, and we replicated that model with them. But they were the first ones I ever partnered with for short stories. So it was I do credit them, and I owe it to them. Of wow, that was really great. And I mean that was wild. I read that story on a Tuesday, and we sold it for 7 figures by Friday.
What?
It was bananas.
These stories, I feel like, are just these like mythical unicorns that you only ever hear about.
That's what I'm talking about. This is why I was like, I'm familiar with Harrison just through Deadline. I don't obviously know him personally or anything, but yeah, exactly what you're saying. I feel like I've read and seen his name a million times, and it seems like he's just pumping out a lot. And does he now write short stories?
He's very talented.
So do you recommend that your clients write short stories? Like, are you now saying to Harrison, "Hey, why don't you, this is, your brother had success here. Maybe this is something you should do as well, and we can try to sell it"?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes.
Oh, okay.
It's a really, I could dive even more. What's so exciting about this model is that it allows for us to sell a short story to film, get that track going, but simultaneously we hold back all publishing rights. So for every short that we have sold, we have done a book deal for, provided the author wants to, right? Like there's always been the interest. Sometimes an author's just like, "I'm not going to fucking write a book. I'm happy. I'm happy with what happened. Thank you very much." But it's also very gratifying too, and to sort of dovetail that with the short film. Very often we would reach a point, particularly on like these sci-fi pieces, where we would hit a ceiling with the risk that a studio would want to take with an emerging director. And sometimes they would give us like this awful Sophie's Choice of like, "We want to continue with the project, but we don't want the director to stay on." And it's just like, that's exactly why they made the short film. The great thing about the short story is that we can sell it to film, have a fantastic screenwriter adapt the short story, but the prose writer stays on and writes the book. So in many ways, they are continuing with their journey as a prose writer, kind of living out that dream because they've got a book deal with Simon and Schuster or otherwise. So no one's taking away their baby. And in fact, they're leaning into their craft, what they're best at, and allowing for someone who frankly is better at screenwriting, more, 9 times out of 10, the Query brothers are the exception, and letting that writer adapt. So it's this wonderful thing where obviously financially it's exciting, but creatively it allows both entities to grow. And then as a producer on the project, it's nice too because it allows the IP to flourish. Whereas I always say when you sell a movie, there's a 15% chance it gets made. When you sell a book, there's a 99% chance it's getting published. So what often happens is we're in development on the film, takes a while, script comes in, needs to do a rewrite, and you're really always trying to make sure you're keeping momentum. I mean, that's like the secret of getting a movie made is keeping everyone excited. So a year into development, a book comes out, and there's a big spread in the newspapers. There's great reviews. People are finding it. It's a wonderful support system for that film project.
Right when people's interest starts going down a little bit, it can peak.
That's right.
Yeah, that's great.
More likely than not, you've plateaued a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm studio executive, like, shit, do I want to, pay for another pass on this thing? And then literally, I mean, I've had this happen where like 5 studios call and like, hey, if you're not going to do anything with this, we want it. I'm like, no, we want it. We're good. We love it.
That's super smart.
It works out beautifully for, sort of holistically across the board. Whereas I don't want to say keeps anybody honest, but is it just a good reminder of the value of the IP?
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you now find that the emails you receive, if there's like a blind submission to you, are they short stories or are they specs? Or like ideas? Are they like, hey, I have a short story for you?
I mean, it's kind of across the board. You always have that weird feeling that 100 people have also gotten the same exact email.
Of course, yeah.
I try to sort of pick and sometimes the blind query just kind of gets you. I'm like, oh, hey, you got me. That's a good hook.
Mm-hmm.
I'll bite. But yes, there's a lot of queries on that. But I often find myself more so in terms of the search for the new writer is one that I'm a bit more proactive on of rather than it's the query that comes in, it's finding sort of that undiscovered writer on Reddit or elsewhere and working with them. But I mean, that's like, look, I understand how hard it is. So I don't want to diminish the query. I'm just being entirely transparent of when it comes in. But look, there's no better feeling in the entire journey of like the sale of like when I get to call a writer who was sort of just banging away on Reddit on no sleep with a day job. And like, there have been times where like, these people have been struggling for a really long time, like literally like sleeping on uncle's couches. And then we get to call them and say, guess what? Like between your film sale and your book sale, you now have made $1 million. Like there's no better call in the world than that.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate enough to have done it a bunch of times now. And like, it's very fulfilling. It really is just the coolest thing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Have you found any of the writers that have these short stories and you go to sell it and you say they're going to bring on another writer? Is that a hard conversation to have with them? Do they often want to become screenwriters, or are they like, oh no, good, I don't want any part of that part of the business?
It's really not an issue. Because I think we're pretty clear up front. I mean, part of why I feel like the short story, at least for me anyway, has taken on even more prominence than the short film, which I still do, but I'm very short story oriented, is there's no ceiling to the talent in which you can attach on a short story, because it's very rich in concept. It's demonstrating a really big idea, but because, again, with the short story, sometimes like you have a first-time director on there, which is fantastic. I've made a handful of films with first-time directors and made tons of shorts with them. I love first-time directors. I really do. But if you're talking about packaging for market, I'm not going to get an A-list actor if I have a director who's never directed a feature film. Like, I just won't.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, there's going to be an exception, but more often than not, I won't. So similarly, even with the writers, when it's a prose writer, and that's usually how they're starting out. It gets a little bit more gray when it's an established screenwriter writing a short story, that's a whole other bucket. But if it's the prose writer, more often than not, this has been their main drive, is writing prose. So the adaptation, I haven't encountered that ever. And also sort of like having built sort of a model at this point, like the rules of engagement are pretty clear in advance.
Yeah.
You know? And frankly, it would be a little prohibitive for me to start on a journey with someone on a short story and they had, zero track record as a screenwriter, and they just said, I'm emphatically attached to screenwrite this. It probably won't get off the ground with me anyway. And that's, look, there's always the exception. And or like if someone had like a ridiculous sample and was like, it was undeniable, sure, of course. But just generally speaking, it's ultimately going to, at one point or another, it's going to inhibit your ability to sell it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I have a random question. What is the shortest short story that you have sold in the sense of like page length? Like, has there ever been like a 1 page?
Oh man, I think
I'm just trying to figure out how to hack the system over here.
No. I have an answer for that. I have an answer. I think my mother-in-law wants to kill me. I think it was like only 2,000 words.
Holy moly!
And that was something that had gone like
what?
That was one that I didn't develop at all. I didn't know the writer. It was on Reddit, and then it went viral on TikTok.
Oh.
And people were like reading the story, but like ridiculously viral. And I tracked down the writer. Yeah. But that was just a very clean concept.
Yeah.
So this is actually another question I had for you is, aside from, obviously we talked about Reddit, but what are the other avenues? TikTok? You can post short stories there. Again, I'm old and not on TikTok, and I'm afraid of it at this point. But I am, for some reason, on Twitter, and I've seen short stories on Twitter. So like, do you look for things on social media where you're like, oh, this is a cool short story, maybe I can develop? I don't know if that even exists.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am agnostic to where the ideas come from. For example, we sold a piece in February called Occupant. And Occupant, we're doing it with Zach Treger and Roy Lee producing at New Line. And there was a story a couple of years ago about a woman who lived in Louisiana, who had her main house, but there was a second house on her property that she just moved into the property. She was convinced this second house was haunted. She couldn't, this is all true, she couldn't tear it down for historical reasons. So she took an ad out on Facebook and said, whoever wants this house can come and get it. So I thought that was really fucking cool.
Yeah.
And I called her and she just told me everything that happened, but no one had come for the house. People came and looked at the house and sort of hemmed and hawed, but nobody actually moved the house. I was like, there's no life right story here. The house never moved. It's just an idea. So that sort of sent me down the rabbit hole of haunted houses and haunted houses that have moved. And it turns out there's a handful of houses that have been moved from one town to the other, seemingly haunted. There's video footage and everything. So I was like, oh, that's a short story. So then ultimately a writer that I had been talking to, trying to find something to collaborate on, I brought him in, Victor Sweeter. And that ultimately became the short story Occupant that we sold. And it's about a haunted house that moves into a neighborhood. And the fun thing about that story and how it turned out is sort of like it turns the haunted house trope on its head, meaning usually people move into a haunted house. Mm-hmm. So for a haunted house to move in, it flipped it. But that was something that, like, I don't know. I think it was like a story in Town and Country or something that I don't normally look at, but a link popped up. And that was the seed. And I also think that's a very fun part of the short story, too, because you can take that inspiration and then, I mean, you can do that for a screenplay as well, of course, but and sort of bleed that into, oh, I wish this really happened versus like, had I not sort of spent the last 18 months selling short stories, I probably would have looked at that story in Louisiana and said, oh, shit, that house never moved. There's nothing here.
Yeah.
So I think it opened up an avenue.
Can we talk about the development of short stories? Because that's really interesting to me, and I think very valuable to writers, because as you mentioned earlier, writing a spec is hard and it takes a really long time. A short story can take much less time, and it just, your sort of time risk there makes more sense if you're writing a short story. So you said that it's not just finding short stories that are completed, but sometimes you'll talk to your writers and say, hey, here's an idea, or an idea you've been thinking of maybe for a spec. Let's do it as a short story. Can you talk about kind of how that process is as a manager for your writers in terms of what you insist they think about when they go to write a short story that they intend to sell for film?
Sure. I mean, it's always, and again, this is just unique to me. Everybody can have their own sort of rules. So there's more than one way to do this. For me, it always comes down to concept. You have to have a big idea, and it has to be really clear. There are wonderful short stories out there that don't have them, but I'm talking about for my purposes in selling to market. I mean, even to the point where half of our stories have imagery on them, and often the imagery, like for example, Occupant is a big old haunted-looking Victorian that's on wheels, and hopefully off of that image, you're like 50% there of like, wait, what is this?
Yeah.
So that's a big litmus test for me. But I mean, it always is about concept, because as a manager, if I'm talking to this writer, or if I'm working with this writer, I'm already a believer in their craft and their ability. So it's about, okay, how do we make sure that you're investing your time and energy into an idea that ultimately will be received commercially, because this part of it is the commercial endeavor. So it's a lot of meditation on the big idea, and that's part one. It's really stress testing it in a way, and what I find is when the idea is strong, the story to hang it on is that much easier. It just is, right? I mean, it's not always the case, but more often than not, it becomes pretty clear that the story that you're supposed to tell. So while you start with one, once really you've nailed part one of figuring out the concept is right, hopefully two falls into place. But two ultimately is a very rigorous exercise. I mean, the amount of time I'm talking to writers, but making sure that this thing is bulletproof, for lack of a better word, and just refining syntax, verbiage. Like it's a little bit different in terms of what you're looking to achieve in a short story versus a script. But to me, it's just very, very important that it's good. Honestly, like at this point, I don't want to go out with anything that I just don't think is like really, really good. We've sent a benchmark, and sort of now it's about like it's kind of like just taking pride in like, this thing has to be fucking awesome. So it's that combination of like a great idea, and then are we truly, truly executing? And look, part of that is, I mean, we live on Google Docs. We're always going back and forth, and I love Google Docs. And it's in comments and editing, whatever it is, down to commas and periods, and just really digging in. I mean, that's I can answer more specifically, but it's really, that's the one too.
How long would you say on average it takes to develop a short story idea with your writers from scratch?
It's a good question. I would say it's a 3-month endeavor usually. Occupant took longer, but I don't know. I was away shooting a movie, and I that probably would have gone quicker if we just like dedicated to it. It just depends on everyone else's focus, frankly, and like what everybody else is doing who's involved. But I think 3 months is probably fair.
Okay, that's
great.
Good number to keep in everyone's head, I think. Would you recommend? So most of our audience are screenwriters who are doing the deep dive. They're, working every day. They're struggling up that hill to, keep this and maintain this as a sustainable career. Would you recommend writers of all kinds, writers who already have paid work, as well as writers who are trying to get that first check? Would you recommend that they start with short stories or put that as part of their tool chest?
The question that I'm getting more and more now is, should I write this as a script or should I write this as a short story?
Yeah.
And to me, if you're asking the question, meaning like you're really unsure versus like, oh, this is a script, I'm going to write this as a script, because I've had, a writer that I work with, and like, I'm writing this as a script, they go write this. And then the next thing I say, should I do this, or this way? And I say that in the sense of like, sometimes it's totally perfectly clear what it should be, and then go for it, right? when it's not, and you're and like, as long as you're being truly honest, right? Like, in terms of like, you have to be honoring the idea. There's a certain type of idea that just wouldn't make sense for a short story. So like, if you're looking yourself in the mirror and like, I'm being real, I'm not like, what should I do? Then my answer is write the short story, or at least starting with the short story, because at minimum, it's getting you out of the gate.
Yeah.
It's getting you iterating on the idea. And at worst, you spent a few days or whatever, writing. You have pages on this idea. So even if you ultimately don't do it as a short story, it maybe has sort of broken the seal on exploring the idea. And again, everybody's got their own process differently, but there's something a little less daunting about just diving onto Word versus Final Draft.
Yes,
It's
100%.
like, oh my God, I've got to write a perfect script, versus like, I can just kind of fuck around here. That I think is very liberating. So that's usually my advice of like, see, and then if it just falls into place, then that's what it's meant to be. But if it gives you an idea or otherwise, there's value in that too.
Yeah.
Do you find value with your current clients to write a short story and then post it on Reddit to see if it can get some heat? And then with the heat from social media, you can then sell it because there's a little bit more, there's momentum behind it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and here's the honest answer. Early on, that was the strategy. It was, let's put it on Reddit, let's get some heat and sort of slingshot that into something. At this point, it's a little less of a prerequisite for what I do, in the sense of fortunate enough to be in a situation where people are sort of leaning in and saying, what's next? So the last 5, we're not on Reddit. I love Reddit. I have a great relationship with Reddit. They're very thoughtful, very kind. They're so artist friendly and always looking to protect the artist in terms of like rights, and like anytime we need them to sign a release or anything, they're like, whatever you need, we will, because BA always sort of needs a handful releases signed before they feel good about chain of title when something's been on Reddit or any other site. And they've been awesome, period. Having said that, I just find less of the need for us to put it on Reddit first. Look, sometimes there's an established Reddit writer who wants to. Great, we can do that. It's no big deal, particularly because Reddit's so user friendly. But at this point, it's just, I don't necessarily need it. I guess I would say you have a little bit more control over the material too, and just in terms of how it's being shared and when, if it's not online. But I wouldn't, particularly with someone who maybe, is trying to break in or otherwise, I would not dissuade them from putting on Reddit at all. There's no downside for someone, particularly if maybe you don't have representation or you're trying to break in or otherwise. Like, that sort of momentum or profile of folks can only help.
I have a related question then. So there are obviously so many levels of writers. There are writers who are making their living by writing, but want that next thing. And maybe even writers at that level, a spec is just too much for them at the time because they have other work or whatever the case is. So they want to write a short story. And typically it feels like that avenue is, I send it to my manager or my agent and they do what you're doing. They just go directly to buyers because I already have a name. Therefore, people would be fine and comfortable if I was screenwriting that. But writers who are maybe under that level, who do have reps and they have done OWAs or they've been out there on the pitch circuit, but they don't yet have that name where Universal would trust them to adapt a short story. How do you recommend that writer go about publishing their short story? Is that like a Reddit situation? I need to publish it somewhere first to get some heat, or go for it?
There's a lot of questions within there, or you raise a lot of questions within your one question. In terms of generating heat, what's nice about a short story, and it's akin to a spec, that if it's good, it's good, and nobody should fucking care who wrote it. That's the great thing about film over even TV, where in TV it's sort of the cumulative experience that probably will get you gigs in terms of getting staffed or otherwise. Whereas like if your spec is amazing, nobody cares what your day job is, nobody cares what your experience is. And I think that's similar to a short. So if your short story is really good, you should be getting attention, particularly now when the town is leaning in. So that's parenthetically, you know, you need to elbow your rep and say, get your shit together.
Yeah.
That's my parenthetical of that. Having said that, in terms of staying on and adapting it, I think it always comes down to, all of these situations always comes down to the number two, and meaning if you have more than one person that wants it, you have the leverage to demand what you want.
Yeah.
And if that's, you know, so that sort of is hand in hand with creating the heat. So sometimes you create the heat so you can get the best offer financially. But if you have a different ask, and it's like your version of it, where it's like, it's not necessarily a reach, but it's not, you know, you wouldn't be the obvious first choice to adapt it. Well, then that's when you try to leverage the situation. And look, there's also sort of the other version of it within the market. And what I mean by that is, and we encounter this a lot, where we don't always take what is the highest bid. We take the best partner. And for each project, it's a different criteria. So very often there's a lot of really great places out there that are like, we're like, there's so much of a greater chance that we're going to make this. Yes, we're not going to give you X number of dollars, but there's a greater chance we'll make it. So, you know, again, that's a individual decision that comes down to the creator of the piece. So similarly, if it's, hey, we're not going to give you as much money, but we'll let you write it, well, then that's your answer.
Yeah.
You know, and then, by the way, you know, from a negotiation standpoint, then you can just play that off to the highest bidder and say, well, they'll let me write it. But that's a whole other thing. But that's how I would look at it. And that's why the creating the heat isn't just like this, you know, sort of phony sizzle. Like, I don't think you can create heat on something that's not good. I don't think so. Or it'll really just be sizzle that fades out. I really do.
Sure.
But to create heat on something that's good, or make sure that it's being positioned right, that's important, right? And then because then it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of, like, whether it's a prose writer and them knowing the rules of engagement. Similarly, with the scenario that you described, it's we do this with any, you know, writer that we work with. It's like, what's your goal? Like, what are we doing here? And sometimes someone's like, I don't give a fuck. I just need to send my kids to college.
Yeah.
I totally respect that.
Yeah.
So, like, great, got it, highest bidder. The other version is like, I've got money, or I don't care about money. I want to adapt this thing. Okay, great. So, you know, that's all about sort of the intake up front with the client.
Yeah.
And really just being clear on the goals, and then honoring those goals. So then when you go to market and you're getting the awareness that hopefully you want, you're prepared to make those moves.
By the way, so glad you take the client's wishes into account, because I know many reps who do not, who rather like convince their client that the way that I want to go is the better way. But you're right. Every client has sort of a different goal, different objective for all of their work.
It's a balance, you know, and not necessarily of a client's wishes, because if they're creating material, they're creating the material. What I mean by the balance is, like, so for example, all too often, you know, I'll get that line from I won't name names, but like X studio or otherwise, to say, we'll give you a third of the money, but we promise we'll make it. And like, that sounds beautiful, but like a year from now, that person might not be at that studio, or otherwise. So it's like, you know, so that is a little bit of the balance that we all deal with, of like, okay, this is not just about the money, but the money is tangible and guaranteed. So it's like, you know, in lieu of A, fine, great, I don't have to have the most money. So what's B? And how are you making that real? Because if I take B, and we're all looking at each other a year from now, it's like, oh, well, X happened or Y happened, and this movie came out, we can't do it. It's like, okay, but I didn't take that money. So, you know, it's a little bit of I don't want to say a gaslight, but a little bit of a thing that we run into every so often. We're like, oh, you're just trying to get the most money. It's like, well, you're literally not promising anything or guaranteeing anything. So I'd rather take the thing that's guaranteed. A little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth clarifying that, because it's a thing that we run into all the time, where sort of like people almost try to play a buyer's play, like a moral card of like,
100%.
oh, you just want money.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you believe in this project the way that we believe in this, you'll take less money. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. I love that line.
And in exchange for what guarantee? Yeah. None. So that's.
But we promise, Scott. We promise we'll make it.
Right. Even though they're working in at a gaming company.
Yeah. Okay. One last question. I swear it's the last question, at least from me. For pre-WGA writers, how do you recommend they go about getting their short story out there if they don't have reps to help them the way that you help your writers?
Well, I think Reddit is really a great place to do it. And I think from there, for example, we talk about queries, right? Where I'm probably setting myself up for getting a lot of emails right now. But for example, if someone's like, hey, I have this story on Reddit, it's the #1 this month, I'll at least read the title. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about Reddit is or I should say specifically No Sleep, that conceptually those titles are designed to lay it all out there.
Sure. Yeah.
I think my mother-in-law tries to kill me or we have a handful of those where it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then from there, I'll read the first paragraph and craft is evident in the first paragraph. It just is, or if it's passing with a great concept, I'll keep reading. It's that simple. So yes, I very much would encourage it. Not, because you never know who's going to see it on Reddit, but then also you have a link and it's like a third party link that almost just, whether it's real or not, makes it feel more real. Like, oh, it exists here versus here's a PDF, there's something about, I'm just anti-PDF in general. It just seems so stale. But it's this
is actually changing me. When I have a short story I'm working on with my manager right now, and I PDF her, and that's stupid. That's so dinosaur. You're right. I should Google Docs this thing. Yeah. That's just it makes more sense.
You have to do, particularly for these shorts. It's for the exchange of ideas. Yes, I'm getting really in the weeds here, but depending on who you give it to, you can give them editorial or you can just give them suggestions. So it's just leave your comments, leave your suggestions. Yes, no, yes, no. Yeah. It's great. So yeah, I would very much encourage them to do that. I post on Reddit, No Sleep. It doesn't mess with your chain of title. It gives you a platform. Frankly, it gets you feedback too. If nobody's upvoting you and nobody is commenting, probably not doing. It could be a cool story, but there's something you're not doing right.
There's a disconnect.
It's just the reality. So gosh, to be able to get that, you can live anywhere in the world. And to be able to get that immediate feedback from an audience is pretty cool.
Yeah. I'm excited. I feel like I want to go work on my short story right after we're done with this.
Yeah. I guess the last thing here are 10 concepts I have. No, I'm just kidding. No. I think this is it. Scott, this was amazing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's super helpful for everyone and just very illuminating on what this process has been for you. It's super cool.
It was a blast. I hope to come back. And I should also give a shout out to, I do all my sales with Verve. So David Boxerbaum and Adam Levine are who I do all the short story sales with.
That's
and
Josh's
then
boy.
Liz Parker does all of our book deals.
Yeah, David's my agent.
Oh, I didn't know that. Fantastic. Yeah. There you go. He's the best. Absolutely the best.
I've never even given him a shout out.
No, you've never. I don't think anyone knows Boxerbaum is your guy. No, he's a selling machine.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He knows exactly what he's doing. Everybody Verve. Yeah, so it's worth mentioning.
Oh man. All right.
You might have to send him an email, Josh, just to say hi.
Yeah. Hey, just checking in.
All right, let's go to the quote of the day. There is no point in having sharp images when you have fuzzy ideas. Jean-Luc Godard.
Boom.
Please remember to rate and subscribe. Follow us at Act2Writers for more awesome writing stuff. You can follow me, Tasha, at Story Thursday on Instagram or Twitter at Tasha 3.0.
I'm Joshua Hallman on Twitter, Josh Hallman Instagram. Scott, do you have any social media that we need to throw out there?
Sure. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Scott Glassgold.
Which I do. Just saying.
It's a good follow. As always, the Act 2 podcast is a production of Act 2, a network and support group for the everyday working screenwriter. This episode was edited by Paul Lundquist, music by 414 Bag, which you can find on Spotify.